You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to bring into this discussion Jonathon Van Maren, who is the communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, which is a very active and dedicated pro-life group. Jonathon, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Andrew.
We spoke at length about this on the show a couple of months ago in a panel with you and our colleagues Alyssa and Scott from Right Now about the state of the conservative movement, specifically as it pertains to social conservatism and a lot of the issues that come along with that. But let's start with a general question here. Were you surprised by what happened on Monday?
No, actually, it's pretty much exactly the outcome that I predicted. Although I will say I thought the People's Party of Canada would do slightly better than it did, based on what people were saying door to door. Like they did really well. Haltom and Norfolk is the riding just across the street here, and they got 11% there, which is pretty high, especially because there's been vote splitting in ridings like that before. But Justin Trudeau getting more or less his minority back was kind of what I thought was going to happen.
So now we've seen, the votes aren't even counted fully, and we've already seen a lot of people come out and call for Erin O'Toole's head on a platter. This is, I think, a standard fare in conservative politics in general. A lot of people tend to adopt that one-and-done mentality. But I do think it's a little bit different now, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, because to some extent, I'm seeing from some of the more blue Tories a bit of payback. Okay, well, you made Andrew Scheer eat his loss in 2019, so we're going to do the same for your guy, Erin O'Toole. But I also think that people had such high expectations for him going into this election that now that it has been lost, I think a lot of people are saying, okay, well, that didn't work.
Well, there's a couple of things going on here. The first thing is that, everybody knew he was running to the left of his base. But what most people didn't point out was that he was actually running against his base. So, for example, 3 days before the vote, you have him coming out saying, we are a socially progressive party, running down a long list of things that the Conservative Party apparently is only if you ignore all of its members of parliament, right? 80% of caucus had voted for a ban on gender selection abortion, as one example, a policy that 84% of Canadians support and 93% of Canadians are in support of. And so when he says things like that, he was basically saying to his MPs, sit down, shut up. I am the party now, and I'm going to tell Canadians what we represent, regardless of what your views are, what your voting record is, why you entered politics, what your constituents want. And the reason there's a lot of schadenfreude about the Scheer result versus him, because Scheer reduced Trudeau to a minority, beat him in the popular vote. Erin O'Toole has less seats, less of a vote. This is, of course, pending all the mail-in ballots getting counted. Is that Andrew Scheer was somebody who was socially conservative but didn't articulate it very well. He had some terrible staffers. He ran from the issues more than he articulated them. But social conservatives still understood he was an actually conservative person. And so even though there was plenty of us who were pretty irritated with him, we all did vote for him at the end of the day. Whereas O'Toole, McKay, that wing of the party said, look, all we need to do is run to the center. We need to dump the SOCONs. We need to onboard more centrists, and then we're going to win. And this has been sort of the media has said this. The Red Tories have said this. Even the Liberals have said this, right? And this is the first time we've actually seen a conservative leader put that into play on the ground and then get completely blown away when you have an incredibly crippled prime minister during an election that nobody wanted. And he can't even outperform the guy who couldn't articulate SOCON values well. So for me, the gratifying part of the coverage, even on the CBC the morning after, was like, oh, Erin O'Toole ran to the center and it didn't work. And that's a much different tune than the media usually sings on election, like post-op, as you know.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there. I would say, looking back to 2019, there was nothing I found particularly objectionable in the platform that Andrew Scheer put in. Of course, I was looking and saying, yeah, it would have been great if there was a bit more red meat. But you had communications nightmare after communications nightmare. You had bad messaging, and then a couple of mini scandals that popped up that weren't handled particularly well, like, dual citizenship and stuff like that.
Dumb stuff.
But the thing with Erin O'Toole is that he reversed his platform, the platform that the party printed and distributed that he had announced on several occasions. The first one was conscience rights for healthcare practitioners, which was a pretty big thing for social conservatives because that was one of the two things that he gave them. He was very transparent in the leadership. He said, I'm not one of you, but I'll give you free votes. and I'll give you conscience rights for healthcare practitioners. And he held the line on that for a couple of days and then eventually flipped and said, okay, there's a duty to refer. And then there were firearms and then other flip-flops as well along the way. And when you only give social conservatives two things, it's pretty significant when you abandon both of those things in the course of 36 days.
Well, that's exactly it. I said on our live stream on election night, by the time election day rolled around, it was hard to figure out which faction of the conservative base he hadn't stabbed in the back. Because the thing about, like, when you pivot to the center, or when you go after new constituencies to expand your votes and get elected, which obviously is his job, you actually have to ensure you hang on to the voters that you do have, especially when you have a challenge from the right. And he completely ignored the BBC until the final days. But if you look at it, right, you mentioned firearms, there was conscience rights, so SOCONs couldn't stand him. Then you had the carbon tax thing. I put it to the listeners and the viewers. What does he do that's conservative? Right, he gave a speech. He gave a speech on election night, which was, this sort of barn-burning victory speech about this is a conservatism that does X, Y, Z. And by the time he was done, I'm like, that does not resemble any version of conservatism that I'm aware of. And I work with a lot of European pro-life groups, and so there are different kinds of conservatism, right? There's especially difference between a Canadian conservatism, a European conservatism, and an American conservatism. And then there's the O'Toole conservatism, which apparently involves screwing over all the conservatives in his own base, promising the left that he's just like them, and then realizing that why would they vote for him if he's just like them, but we'll give them less stuff than the other guy? There isn't really a compelling reason to vote for, a less attractive version of Justin Trudeau.
When we had the 2020 leadership race, I guess it was very much Peter MacKay versus everyone. You had at the time Derek Sloan appealing to social conservatives, Leslyn Lewis appealing to social conservatives, and Erin O'Toole, who was, I think, the third choice for a lot of social conservatives, but very much was the I'm not Peter MacKay candidate to people on the right flank of the party, despite the true blue messaging. I don't think he was misrepresenting. I think everyone knew where he was. But do you think the result of this now is going to be a correction back to a Leslyn Lewis type candidate, to a Pierre Poilievre type candidate? Do you think that people will look at this and say, okay, we tried playing by the rules of what all those conservative consultants tell us to do, which is forget about the base and go after the center, it didn't work? Or do you think that it's a double down moment for those people?
Well, so the Red Tories are going to double down because they have to. Right. I think Erin O'Toole realizes that even if he gets a second crack at leadership, he's not going to get a second crack at getting most of that base back, because he realized during this election he couldn't just rely on their loathing of Trudeau, which is what he was counting on. And that was a fair bet, that people hated Trudeau so much they were going to hold their nose and vote for him anyways. Well, that bet failed when people had the chance to get rid of Trudeau. I have a very specific view on what we should do moving forward. And we discussed this at length previously on one of your shows with some other guests about what is social conservatism in Canada. And I really believe there's an enormous opportunity for social conservatives to change the way we talk about these things and to take the issue of choice off the table. So I wrote a piece in Convivium in the early days of the election, noting that Justin Trudeau promised over $300,000 to the University of New Brunswick to research where abortion access could be improved, right? How can we get more women, more abortions, basically? And I said, look, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, which is the most radical pro-abortion group in the country, said in 2018 that a slim majority of women actually don't want abortions. Like, they're getting abortions because they, quote, feel like they have no other choice. A conservative candidate who understood that you can be socially conservative without picking legislation that is going to kill you in the court of public opinion would say, actually, we're going to be giving $400,000 to commission a study into why these women are having abortions they don't want, and how to figure out how to get the support that they actually want. And then start talking about unwanted abortions instead of unwanted babies, right? Trudeau assumes that there's a lot of unwanted babies and no unwanted abortions. What if we just came from a different assumption, took the issue of choice off the table, and started working towards policies that looks like that? So I think O'Toole has to go, and that won't surprise you. There's lots of phone calls flurrying around at the moment. There's plenty of MPs who feel the same way, especially MPs who feel like, victory solves a lot of stuff. So if he had insulted them, screwed them over, treated them with contempt, and then won, all would probably be forgiven today, albeit begrudgingly. But because he did all of that and lost, there's a lot of people who want his head on a platter, right? Bert Chen has already got a petition out. out for his removal. So I think I want Leslyn Lewis for leader, which I've been saying for a couple of years, because I think that for social conservatives, we need a paradigm shift politically. We need to move away from trying the same pieces of legislation we've been putting forward for 25 years. And I want a female candidate to talk about the abortion issue for a change. Somebody that just eliminates the primary thing we always end up debating and gets into the nitty-gritty of Canada has 100,000 abortions a year. That's the same number of abortions as they have in Germany, and they've got 50 million more people. So what can we do to change the status quo, seriously speaking? How do we cut that in half?
Yeah, you are right about this. And I know that conservatives are naturally resistant to the idea of identity politics, but you have to play the rules of the game as they are. You don't get to write new rules. This is how the media is. This is how the Liberals are. And it would be fascinating to see Justin Trudeau try to out-feminist Leslyn Lewis, which would be his instinct. He would try to say, no, I speak for women more than this female candidate.
Plus,
and it doesn't have to be Leslyn Lewis. It could be anyone.
Thing just mixes it up too, right? Like that's the thing is, Canada is a very diverse country. I do think there's something to be said that a lot of immigrant communities would want to vote for somebody who looked like them, or at least see somebody soar to the top. Leslyn Lewis was the come-from-behind candidate in the last leadership race. But I would pay a lot of money to watch. I don't think he'd debate her. I think if there was a leadership race and she did become leader, which is a whole lot of ifs, I think he'd take his walk in the snow at that point, because I don't think he wants to go up against the black female candidate on any of those issues. But like Leslyn Lewis also has a very powerful story, right? When I interviewed her about abortion and just asked her where her convictions came from, they said they tried to push her into having an abortion when she was young. So she's experienced that as a woman from the other side of things. Trudeau's like, more abortions for everyone. Right. And I'm going to defund crisis pregnancy centers just in case they help you out with an abortion that you don't want. Right. Abortion's an objective good for him. And that's because, his mom had one. She's talked about that publicly. His dad brought abortion to Canada. Abortion is fundamentally part of the Trudeau family legacy. But to see a female candidate who has a very different experience of this, put it forward in a way that could clear the decks for a reasonable discussion. And by a reasonable discussion, I mean, no, we're not going to ban abortion. Canadians aren't going to be able to, they're not going to take that anytime soon. But we can move the Overton window by talking about abortion as a tragedy that is frequently, if not more than half of the time, unwanted by the person procuring the abortion. And we as a society can do a lot about that. And as a pro-life activist, if we put in place policies that mean 20,000 less abortions every year, I'll sleep well at night.
Yeah, and I want to bring it back to the OToole problem here, because you touched on something very important there, which is the need to change the discussion. And I was talking about this earlier in the show, not in the context of abortion, but in general, the conservative default to taking a defensive position instead of an offensive position on every issue. And part of this is because, and I know this from covering the conservative campaign, most of the questions that the media will ask him are from a liberal premise. And that's just the reality of media. What is government going to do about X? What are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this issue, that issue? It's always coming from a left-wing premise. However, when the response, the talking points tend to endorse that premise, it doesn't advance the ground anymore. So this is why you had in 2019 Andrew Scheer basically apologizing for being pro-life with Erin O'Toole. Again, you don't have any pushing back. I would say, well, hang on. Yeah, why was Justin Trudeau not against gender-based abortion? Why is Justin Trudeau not letting women make this choice? He says it's their choice. Why does that not include the right to go to a crisis pregnancy center? And when conservatives come across as not particularly well-heeled in their convictions, it only moves us backwards.
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack there. In the instance of Andrew Scheer, of course, he didn't take the help that was offered, I think, too, is that he could have re-articulated the abortion discussion. He didn't have to play defense on that issue. And this is the thing that's driven me the craziest over the last 5 to 6 years, is there's a lot of people playing defense on issues they don't need to play defense on. In terms of the way the discussion is locked in, I interviewed Jonathon Kay on our election night live stream because I wanted to talk to a reasonable social liberal and say, why do you think the discussion is the way it is? Why are we the only Western nation with no abortion law and the only Western nation that can't actually discuss this issue?
That's another point conservative politicians could bring up.
And they never bring up, they're like, oh, look, they want to drag us back to the Handmaid's Tale. I'm like, no, I'm just talking about Sweden or Germany. It's like that's
those Handmaid's Tale dystopias of Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. The Scandinavian socialist country was my point of reference there, actually, not Gilead, but But the thing is that I think this discussion benefits three groups of people. It's the CBC that loves to talk about abortion, but also loves to insinuate that Canada is a more progressive country than all other countries, especially and including the United States. Then there's the red Tories who, and you know this as well as I do, there's some red Tories who are just, politicos who want to get elected. There are plenty of red Tories that actually hold social conservatives in contempt, is they actually don't like us. They think it's embarrassing that we're in the same party as them, and they were praying desperately to whatever God they pray to that Erin O'Toole was going to eke out a win so that they could have proof of concept that if we offload the crazies, we can onboard the reasonable people and we can go to all the cool cocktail parties. And then there's the liberals who only drag out abortion around election time. And so the whole idea that the conservatives are scary and are going to ban abortion benefits the red Tories because they can say, look, we need to get rid of all these social conservatives because these attacks are killing us. And the liberals can drag it out every time and insist that the conservatives are going to do something that Harper showed no interest in doing over 10 years. And that the pro-life groups aren't pitching if you look at what we're actually asking for. And so that we get stuck. And when I come forward and others have come forward and we're looking like, look, there are so many things that we can accomplish that allow us to have a debate completely outside the issue of legality. And nobody's interested because it's serving a whole bunch of people so well, right? Andrew Scheer could have run with this. I do think if there is a leadership race, I think the next conservative leader is going to be much more open to how do I get social conservatives on board without getting murdered in the press. And we saw Pierre Lemieux do it with his social conservative values or Canadian values speeches during the leadership race. We saw Leslyn Lewis do it. She went on CTV and Global, debated her no hidden agenda platform, and they just didn't know what to do with her because they're like, oh, yeah, no, most Canadians support that. That's super reasonable, and you're a woman, so I can't.
And because, to go back to the previous point, they're used to conservatives apologizing for their views.
Yeah, they're not used to them defending it, right? Like, it's the same thing with
and making it like a key plank of your platform, too.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with puberty blockers for kids. Like, there's a long list of issues where a plurality of Canadians is solidly in the social conservative camp, and most of those issues, especially the more recent issues in the last 5-6 years, the Conservative Party has literally given up without a fight. Like, never, like, oh, that seems like an issue that the Liberals are going to say mean things about us for, so we're not even going to talk about it. Like, the discourse in this country on anything cultural is so incredibly impoverished. Look, I know, like for example, firearms is an issue near and dear to your heart. It's going to drive you nuts to watch the way the discussion unfolds, and it's just a stack of garbage premises, and that's the whole discussion. And you're sitting there on the sidelines like none of that stuff is true. And even the stuff that is true is presented in such a way that it isn't true anymore. And we all have to just sit there and watch that debate take place, and there's no leader who can speak articulately to any of our issues.
Yeah, welcome to my world, week 3 of the campaign. Jonathon Van Maren, Communications Director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. Always a pleasure, Jonathan. Thanks for coming on.
You bet. Thanks a million, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.